to include Kyiv, the capital, and at least one other major city. And if that's Kharkiv to the east, it would make sense because it is the second largest city, home to about 1.5 million people or so. And it could help President Putin, if this is his intention, try and claim the eastern third of the country, cut it off from the capital to prevent Ukrainian troops from falling back to defend it.
Let's go back to how this all started. It was a slow build-up to a possible attack. Were the Ukrainian people prepared for this?
Well, they had not necessarily been put on a war footing, but today a tone changed as President Zelensky started calling up reservists, 36,000 of them, to reinforce the Ukrainian military. He also got on the phone with world leaders, President Biden included in recent days, appealing for financial support and other support for the Ukrainian military. And the country's National Security Council called for a state of emergency, and that's to allow authorities to impose curfews or limit transport, do other things to try and get ahead of any threats that may arise. And that was a real signal that they thought something was coming. And then the Ukrainian military began to brief members of parliament, telling them that an invasion was coming and coming soon, and preparing them that it was going to be much bigger than the fighting that we've seen in this country for the last 8 years in eastern Ukraine.
And Aaron, you mentioned the calling up of reservists. How else has the country ensured that its people are going to be safe?
Well, they have certainly been well aware of the warnings from the United States and its European partners, Andrew. They know what the dire warnings have sort of built up. And although there's really been no outward sign of panic here, we know that in more recent days, in talking to people, they've begun to sense that something was up and privately may have begun to make plans. I visited a gun shop here in Lviv, and the manager was telling me that he's had a good deal of interest in recent days, people coming in wanting to know about firearms for self-defense or to protect their families. We've also heard of Ukrainians taking up arms in preparation to fight the Russians, should it come to that. There's a good sense of patriotism here. It's a country of 40 million people, and they are not going to go down without a fight. As President Zelensky had said, the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military are ready for whatever Vladimir Putin may have in store.
And now that a Russian invasion appears to be underway, have there been any evacuations?
We haven't really heard of any, and it seems as if that this feared mass exodus to Poland may not have started, but it's very early in this conflict, and indeed the busier direction at the crossing with Poland seemed to be the other way, as Ukrainians wanted to come back to their country, even knowing that something may be afoot. President Zelensky made a last-ditch appeal to try and avoid hostilities. He did it in Russian to Russians, well aware that his voice may never have been heard in Russia proper, but he wanted to get a message out to say that Ukraine wants peace, that it is not the aggressor that it has been portrayed in Russia in recent days. And he was hoping to sort of mobilize Russian support against what President Putin is doing, even though he undoubtedly knew it would fall on deaf ears.
And Ukraine's president made a plea for peace today, even saying that he tried to call Putin and was met with silence. How have the Ukrainian people reacted to their leadership in this trying time?
You know, I think there's been something of a rallying around Zelensky. He is the democratically elected leader, and although he's a political novice, having come from the world of entertainment, he's been doing all of the things a president can do. He's been urging calm, and indeed we haven't seen any signs of anything but in the last more recent hours, he has started to make his people aware of perhaps what's to come. And now our teams have heard the explosions in the capital of Kyiv. Zelensky has been urged by the United States to leave the capital for his own safety, but we believe he is still there, although he has sent parliamentarians back to their constituencies to be with the people.
Aaron, thank you, and be safe. Now, there will no doubt be economic impacts from what's happening overseas tonight, globally and here in the United States. So we turn to ABC's Elizabeth Schulze for more. Elizabeth, there have already been sanctions announced. Has the White House indicated yet how they will respond to this particular escalation?
Well, Andrew, the White House has released a statement from President Biden that called this an unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine and vowing that the world will hold Russia accountable. So what that will look like is these severe economic penalties that they have been teeing up in case this type of invasion happens. We do know that so far the sanctions have been pretty targeted, focused on a few Russian banks, on the financial system, on oligarchs. This next round, the White House has said, will be coordinated again with its allies and could include broader measures, things like export controls, which would make it difficult for Russia to get access to critical technologies. They're talking about targeting bigger banks that could affect more Russian households, the broader Russian economy, and the possibility of personal sanctions on President Putin hasn't been completely ruled out. You know, ultimately, the attempt here is to show that we have a lot of measures that we can still take that will severely cripple the economy. The U.S. says it's prepared to do this with its allies, and President Biden is expected to make this announcement in a public address tomorrow, Andrew.
And how much could tonight's attack further rock the financial markets?
Well, if there's one thing the stock market doesn't like, it's uncertainty, and this is a big dose of it. We are already seeing stock market futures trade lower, and those losses have accelerated as the scope of this has become more clear. You know, one of the biggest questions for traders is how long is this going to last? And of course, we don't know that at this point. So a lot of traders tell me that you can expect very choppy and bumpy trading in the coming days, maybe weeks, as we try to kind of look at how this is going to play out. Some of those safe haven assets like gold, where a lot of investors go in times of uncertainty, are trading higher. And of course, oil prices are trading higher now in the wake of this announcement. That is one of the key things we're watching when it comes to the effects on the Russian economy and on the overall economy, too.
And this could have a real and immediate impact on Americans. We're already seeing a lot of pain at the pump. How high could gas and energy prices go from here? And are these price hikes expected to last?
This is the question. We are seeing, Andrew, already Brent crude oil prices close to $100 a barrel in the wake of this news tonight. That means that the price that you are going to pay at the gas pump could eventually go higher with crude oil prices going higher. So, you know, remember, Russia is the third largest producer, exporter of crude oil in the world, the second largest exporter of natural gas. A lot of this is going to mean that European consumers pay higher prices at the pump or in their heating bills, especially if what Russia decides to do is retaliate in response to these sanctions that we expect to be announced by the U.S. and by its allies. If Russia then decides to pull back supply from the market to further disrupt the oil market, that could mean that there's more disruption for consumers here, and that could result in higher prices. You know, we've already seen prices go up so much. Gas prices are up 20 cents for the national average gallon of gas here in the U.S., and a lot of analysts say you can expect to see $4 gallon of gas if we continue to see these oil prices trending higher, Andrew.
And Elizabeth, is there anything the Biden administration can do to try to mitigate the economic fallout here in the U.S.?
You know, this is a message that the White House has been trying to send, saying we understand that Americans will bear some of the pain of these measures that we are imposing. And part of that is the cost of democracy, they say. But on the other hand, inflation is already a problem here in the U.S. It's already pinching Americans. So they've tried to say we're making a coordinated effort, the U.S. with other countries around the world, to stock up on oil reserves in case Russia does decide to pull back, to stock up on natural gas reserves, to try to say we are prepared, we have enough ready to go to subvert some of the shocks that could be in place here in the market. At the same time, the U.S. isn't ruling out other options like releasing oil from its strategic petroleum reserve. This is something that it did earlier this year when we saw gas prices going up. How much of an effect that will have for the average person going to fill up at the tank, not very clear at this point. And ultimately, this is a global market. So when there are big shocks and big disruptions like this, it does trickle down to the consumer, you and me here at home. Andrew.
Elizabeth Schulze there in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Let's turn now to ABC News contributor and retired General Robert Abrams. General Abrams was an advisor to former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel during the last invasion of Ukraine, and more recently was the head of U.S. forces in Korea. Thank you, General. Okay, so U.S. defense officials were expecting this invasion to come tonight under the cover of night. Why this timing? Why in the dark? And was this meant to be a surprise attack?
Well, I think the timing, there's a lot of factors on the timing. and you've touched on a couple of them. Historically and typically, military operations, we like to initiate them under the cover of darkness. The advantage goes to the attacker, and it's when it disrupts people's circadian rhythm. It's disruptive to people's sleep cycles, the Ukrainian military people's sleep cycles, and so forth. So striking during the hours of darkness gives the advantage to the attacker. Why today, I think, is tied to several factors. I think the weather had something to do with it. Weather fairly good today across the country, not as good in the east. But as I've said a number of times, the weather factor swings in both directions. It may not have been ideal for the attacker, but it's not ideal for the defender either. And so I think that was probably a neutral state of play between the attacker and the defender. I think there's some symbolism on starting it today. This is the Russian Army Day of Remembrance. And I think there's in Putin's mind, there was a little symmetry there to be able to initiate this defense of Russian people in eastern Ukraine on the same day. So I think many of those things played into his decision to launch his attack today.
What do you expect the Russian military forces to do in the coming hours? It's just after 6 a.m. in Ukraine. What could morning look like?
Well, look, I think we need to pay attention to what Putin said. What he said was, we're going to do a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine and denazify Ukraine. So I think we should kind of step back away from the tactics of what we can expect to see. I think he's made a declarative statement that he intends to destroy or completely disarm the Ukrainian military, and it will not be limited to one part of the country. When he says demilitarize, that means destroy or disarm their capability to defend themselves. And then on the denazification, I think that's not a veiled threat. That is a clear, unambiguous threat to the leadership, the elected governmental officials of Ukraine, that he intends to replace them. What we should be asking is, if Putin and Russia is successful, how does this end? How does he put his own government, somebody who is sympathetic to Russia, who will be a puppet for Putin and the Russian regime? How will that play out? But I think he has signaled to Ukraine and signaled to the international community what his true intentions are here.
And let's go back to the aid for Ukraine. How much could the military assets provided by the U.S., like those Javelin missiles, help Ukraine in a conflict with a country like Russia?
So those, the Javelin missiles and other arms and ammunition that are being provided by other NATO countries will be enormously helpful to the Ukrainian military. But as Steve pointed out earlier, the Ukrainian military is good. They're very good, and they're a lot better than they were in 2014. But unfortunately, size does matter, and numbers do matter when it comes to squaring these two countries up against each other. And Russia has a decisive advantage in a couple of areas. They have it in surface-to-surface missiles. They have it in combat aircraft. They have it in combat helicopters. And that is something that Ukraine just does not have, and it puts them at a military disadvantage. So I suspect and I fully expect that the Ukrainian military will put up a very stiff defense. But we're looking at some very tough days. The amount of firepower that Russia has aligned against the Ukrainian military right now is enormous. And I would expect us to see it completely unleashed here in the next 24 hours.
Some tough days ahead. General Abrams, thank you. Let's bring in former Homeland Security official and ABC News contributor Elizabeth Newman now. Today, Ukraine experienced some smaller scale cyber attacks, but Russia is capable of much larger cyber attacks. Talk about what those could look like.
Right, so today we initially saw some DDoS attacks, those are denial of service attacks, which think about not being able to access your bank or a government website where you need some information. It's disruptive, but it's not really of the size and scale that we expect. But then later this afternoon, we actually got word that some malware had been released. It's a data wipe malware, and it had infected, reports are up to hundreds of computers in Ukraine, and the damage that type of attack can cause could be significant depending on which places were targeted. And what some of the cyber experts are postulating, it's all pretty early to deduce everything, but they think that the DDoS attacks may have been launched to be able to distract from the other activities embedding this malware in networks. So it is very possible and likely that we will see more attacks kind of unfurl over the next few days, and with a particular focus on Ukraine. And the purpose of those is to try to cause more disruption, and in particular damage and disrupt the ability to communicate with the public, as well as to exercise command and control of the military and organizing your response as a government. So I would expect to see more of those. We might also see attacks on infrastructure, taking out the energy grid. They actually did this to Ukraine back in 2015, took out power for about 1 to 6 hours for about 230,000 people. And we know that Russia has pretty significant capabilities, so I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg at this point.
Bringing this full circle, there's serious concern about the prospect of cyber attacks right here in the United States by the Russian government. What is the likelihood that could actually happen?
I think it's pretty significant. You've seen DHS and the Department of Justice actively try to raise the alarm about potential cyber attacks, and they've been doing this for months. They've been putting out bulletins, they've been holding calls with state and local officials, with private businesses, with the banks, anybody that is an owner or operator of critical infrastructure with a particular focus on finance, communications, internet, energy, oil and gas. We are very concerned that those businesses and critical infrastructure are going to be targeted, may already be in the process of being targeted, because of course in the way that cyber warfare is conducted, you often try to infiltrate, plant viruses, plant malware that is quiet and silent, and then you activate it when you need it. So the battlefield has probably already been prepped, and they've been trying to alert everybody to be on the lookout for suspicious activity, shields up, as they say. But from an American citizen standpoint, what does this mean for us? It could mean that we see disruptions. You remember that we had the Colonial Pipeline attack. It was a ransomware attack, a little bit different than probably what we would see in this circumstance, but it didn't take much. It didn't take much to shut down that pipeline, and disruptions to gas supplies occurred pretty quickly. Prices went up, and then there were parts of the country where there were lines and people had to wait for the gas tank to come and fill up the station in order for them to fill up their cars. So those types of disruptions are very plausible, and we saw Putin kind of threaten that tonight. I do wonder if his threat to the U.S. and to the West, that we may, if we involve ourselves in some way, we might see attacks of the like that we haven't ever seen in our history before. That could be a reference to cyber warfare. We really have not seen the full scale of what it would look like for the United States and Russia to go head-to-head from a cyber perspective, because, of course, if they attack us, we have some offensive capability as well. We would likely retaliate, and where does that go? So the world's never seen that, and that is, that's a little disturbing. I think I know that the people in the United States government that manage those capabilities are very mindful of the precedent that entering into cyber conflict may set, and the dangers that might pose. But we will see how Russia chooses to handle itself.
A lot more to monitor. ABC News contributor Elizabeth Newman, thank you. And now we want to check back in with former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor. Thank you for joining us again. Now, in a statement, the White House said that the president plans to deliver remarks tomorrow announcing further consequences for Russia. What could those further consequences be?
Andrew, he could pull out all the stops, and he should pull out all the stops. This is a major violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, major violation of international law, major invasion of a sovereign nation, in violation of everything that has kept the peace for all this time. And we have been very clear. President Biden has been very clear. The allies have been very clear that if he does this, if President Putin does this, which he has now done, that we will throw all of these sanctions and all of these export bans at him. And so I would imagine that we will see the maximum level of sanctions against top Russian banks, maybe SWIFT, maybe against the Russian central bank. This is a nuclear option in financial sanctions, is the Russian central bank. I would imagine, and I would hope, that all of these would be on the table. All of these not only on the table, would be implemented. Now is the time. President Putin has done what we said we didn't want him to do, and if he did, we were going to sanction him at the top level. At the top level, we should go to the top level of that escalation.
Now, I want to play you a dramatic moment, end of the UN Security Council meeting that just wrapped. It was a Ukrainian ambassador addressing his Russian counterpart. Take a listen.
There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
What's your reaction to that?
He's absolutely right. This is a war crime. The number of civilians and military who will die because of what Mr. Putin has ordered will be enormous. Will be thousands, tens of thousands. Unprovoked attack on a nation, a sovereign nation, on Putin's border, killing thousands of civilians and military. This is a war crime. The ambassador is absolutely right. President Putin will go down with other war criminals, like in the past century, who ordered attacks on innocent people, who ordered attacks on nations on their borders. President Putin will go down with that club, with that group of people, that group of war criminals.
Now that we're here, this crisis has been building for weeks. Do you think the United States and NATO allies did enough in terms of sanctions, in your opinion, beforehand to try and prevent what just happened here tonight?
So the NATO allies and the United States took a lot of steps before this happened, and that was a good thing. They moved a lot of troops. They moved a lot of units from the United States to Eastern Europe. They moved a lot of U.S. forces from Germany, from parts of Europe into the eastern flank of NATO. Those were active steps, active deterrence. That was an attempt to deter President Putin from what he's done today. So that deterrence has now failed. And now we go into exacting the price. We said we were going to do this. We're going to exact a price for doing this on his economy, on him, on his industry. Now's the time to do that.
What could be the next move from NATO allies then if those sanctions did not deter Russia from invading?
So two things. One is to continue to provide and increase dramatically the assistance that now the Ukrainian military needs more than ever. Ukrainian military is on its own. There are no NATO forces there to help them, to fight with them, to fight alongside of them. So they need support. They need equipment. They need ammunition. They need the basis of resistance, and they are going to need then continued support to resist the Russians as they try to occupy. The Russians can get in. The Russians can get into Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. When they try to hold, when they try to do something, if they try to do what the general talked about in terms of replacing this government, they try to occupy a nation of 40 and 44 million people, many of whom, millions of Ukrainians will be fighting the Russians, the occupiers, on the streets of their villages and towns and forests. This will be miserable for the Ukrainian, for the occupiers of Ukraine, the Russians, and the United States and other NATO allies from the NATO flank, from the eastern flank, will be supporting this resistance, these civilian resistance, the military resistance, the territorial defense forces. Ukrainians will fight. Their military will fight right now. Their territorial defense forces will then fight once the occupiers try to come into their, and the civilians will fight as well.
It's now dawn in Ukraine, a new dawn. You know so many people there. Have you heard from anyone you know as Ukrainians wake up to what's going to be an incredibly challenging day?
I'm hearing from Ukrainians who've been up all night. They've been up all night. So they've been watching this as we have. And they are just as determined as I just said. These are people who are determined to save their country, to protect their country, to protect their freedom. They've lived under Russian control before. They don't want to go back. They will defend, they will fight, and in the end, Andrew, they will prevail.
It's a new day in Ukraine. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, we appreciate your time. And thank you for joining our special coverage this evening as Russia begins what senior Pentagon officials are calling an invasion of Ukraine. I'm Andrew Dymburt. Good night.
More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. This is what being live is all about. This is ABC News Live.
All right, we're gonna move out. Let's move out.
We're surrounded by people squeezing into this bomb shelter.
We're on an urgent delivery run.
Not afraid to go there.
So my question, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Breaking news, live events.
This is the moment.
Streaming straight to you, anytime, anywhere.
You just met one friend right here.
You're watching ABC News Live. Thanks for streaming with us.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter.
Feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Now streaming on ABC News Live.
It's all about you.
They were a killing team.
A mother and daughter poisoning our family members.
I mean, this is unheard of. Who does that?
I knew they were drinking antifreeze.
What? Nobody just drinks antifreeze.
It's incredible.
She's never talked publicly until now. How is it that you could kill your own family?
There's more to that than what people know.
What is the truth, Diane?
Take America's #1 news Friday at 9 Central on ABC. Anytime, take America's #1 news with you. Anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it
Yeah,
now.
that's right. And speaking to people here, they have been making preparations. They have been taking this threat extraordinarily seriously, even though in recent weeks the Ukrainian government had been downplaying the threat, saying that a full-scale invasion simply would not happen. People here were taking those Western simply would not happen. People here were taking those Western intelligence assessments extremely seriously. They were preparing for the worst. I was out in a suburb of Kyiv one weekend watching as ordinary Ukrainians were learning things such as how to administer first aid, how to evacuate the wounded, how to fire a weapon. And speaking to people there, they said, we're preparing for the worst, but you know what, we really don't think that they're going to go after the capital, but, you know, better be safe than sorry. That was the attitude then, and they're facing a completely different reality right now, Ali.
Let me ask you, you've been reporting all evening that you've not heard, it's morning for you now, but you've not heard the sirens that one would typically hear. Kyiv does have that siren system. Kharkiv has that siren system. Matt Bradley said the same thing. He heard explosions, but no sirens. Do you have has anybody in the government provided any explanation as to why they're not activating sirens if things are exploding in Kyiv?
We have yet to hear from city officials reacting to the events of this early morning. I was speaking to city officials prior to today. As early as this week, they were scrambling to get the city ready for a possible attack, dusting off bomb shelters, creating evacuation plans, creating plans for contingency plans for elementary schools, critical infrastructure. They were trying to locate satellite phones. The city official telling me that they needed 500 satellite phones for critical infrastructure sites. They didn't have those yet. They couldn't get them in Ukraine. They were actually appealing to the U.S. Embassy for help with that, and they were waiting for those satellite phones. So there's just sort of the basic preparations that were underway just as early as this week, even though they've known this threat was looming for some time. I had been told by a city official that they had tested the siren system, although nobody could hear it. They said that they tested it to see if it was working. They said that it was. But again, we have confirmation from an advisor to the Minister of Interior that there have been missile strikes in Kyiv at airfields and military installations, and we have yet to hear a single siren, Ali.
This is an important point that you just made. Courtney Kube was talking to us earlier about that what the Russians may do in the rest of Ukraine beyond the eastern side is attack those things that would cause the Ukrainians difficulty in defending themselves. So airfields, military installations, and certain government installations would more likely be the target than residential or commercial enterprises.
Yeah, that's right. And we have yet to see any reports of any civilian infrastructure, anything like that having been hit so far. But again, we are continuing to hear explosions really on all sides of where I'm standing. I've heard an explosion in the distance to the back, to my left, to my right, and this has been going since the early hours of the morning, and we are waiting for even more clarity from authorities here.
All right,
Ali.
your camera's staying on, your shot is staying up, so you let us know as soon as you have any more information, and we'll come right back to you. Stay safe, Aaron McLaughlin in Kyiv for us. I want to go to White House correspondent Mike Memoli in Washington, D.C. Obviously, the president fully informed about what's going on here. What's the latest?
Yeah, Ali, we've been getting periodic updates from White House officials throughout the night, and my colleague Peter Alexander just shares a significant development, I think. President Biden is actually on the phone right now with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Obviously, an important consultation at this late hour in Washington, but in the very early hours there in Kyiv to show support for our ally at this very critical moment. Just before we learned of that, the White House press secretary Jen Psaki tweeting that the president had just convened a secure phone call with his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, as well as his National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Earlier, they also had said he would be monitoring developments closely throughout the night and getting updates as they continue from Jake Sullivan. Now, the last we heard from the president directly was in the form of a paper statement released about an hour ago, which began by saying that the thoughts and prayers of the entire world were with the people of Ukraine. And then we heard in that statement from the president much of what we've been hearing from this president throughout the last few weeks, laying this entire conflict, this entire crisis, squarely at the hands of President Putin, saying it is Putin who has chosen to make an unprovoked and unjustified attack, that this is Putin who is alone responsible for death and destruction that this attack will bring. And then Biden signaling how he will respond, saying that the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a decisive way. Now, what's next in terms of the president's schedule? We know tomorrow morning he is scheduled at 9 o'clock Eastern time to have a meeting, a virtual meeting with the leaders, fellow leaders of the G7. Now, this was actually a meeting that had been on the president's schedule for some time. Germany is set to formally assume the presidency of the G7 tomorrow, but obviously this gathering now squarely focused on the developments in Ukraine. And then a White House official sharing that after that meeting, sometime in the early afternoon tomorrow, the president will again come to the camera, speak directly to the American people about the latest situation and how the U.S. will move from that point forward. Ali, the story throughout the day has been whether the initial sanctions that President Biden announced just about 30 hours ago right now were strong enough to match what we know Putin was capable of. The indication from the White House in the president's statement tonight is that in his remarks tomorrow, the president will go further. And as he has said throughout, we will judge our next response based on how Putin proceeds. In the last 24 hours, really, at the White House, we've been hearing from White House officials this sense that yes, everything that they're predicting has come true so far, and they were predicting at that moment an imminent invasion of the kind that we now seem to be seeing unfold, that they were hoping that they were wrong. Clearly, they're not, but that they're now prepared to go even further in terms of the sanctions posture.
Worth noting that the G7 that you were talking about used to be the G8, because Russia used to be in it. And during the Trump administration, there were some efforts to get Russia back into the G8 by that administration. Mike, we'll keep in touch with you on this. I want to go to Ambassador Mike McFaul. Ambassador, I just want to point out to our viewers right now, for those watching markets, obviously they are tumbling around the world. Oil prices, Brent crude, which is not the crude oil that we use here in America, but that has topped $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. Our crude, the U.S. light sweet crude, is on its way up there, around $97 a barrel. This is, of course, important because the one thing Russia has, and the one cudgel that Russia has over its European neighbors, is oil and gas.
That's right. Sorry, Ari, I was just reading different comments from various Ukrainians, so I was not listening to the oil and gas part. But you're right. Oil and gas prices rising. That's going to be good for Russia. That's what they said. They're not afraid of sanctions. We've had a lot of conversations about sanctions, and we should, I suspect we will see massive comprehensive sanctions tomorrow morning once they're all coordinated between the Biden administration and the rest of our allies. But because of the fact that you just mentioned, we're not going to see the effects of sanctions on the Russian economy immediately, and I think it'll take months or years before it has any impact. But Ollie, I just want you to know, I travel to Ukraine a lot. I know hundreds of Ukrainians. I'm looking at 5 messages from different Ukrainians right now, fairly senior people that I'm not going to I don't have their permission to report on, but I think it's important to know. I'm hearing from people that would be informed that all airports around Kiev and their communication systems are now being attacked. I'm hearing from somebody else that's saying panic is already here. People are leaving Kiev, and other people in different parts of the city that are hearing explosions. And I want to say that because it's hard to know. We are in the very early phases of this military invasion. And I think we should be careful that we should not presuppose that, pre-guess that we know what ultimately is happening here. I think we're just in the early stages, and I think there's tragically going to be a lot more to come.
Yeah, and we're looking actually at a live picture of Kyiv right now, and you can't see any of that stuff. But to the point that you make, Ambassador, there's a strategy. The White House has actually been pretty accurate all along about what the Russians were going to do to this point, and they seem to think, this administration seems to believe, that the Russians have designs on stuff that goes far beyond eastern Ukraine, the area that they call disputed.
Well, that's right. And Mr. Putin said it tonight. How do you do denazification, in his view? And I want to keep reminding people, there are no Nazis in Ukraine running the country. There are scattered little groups. Mr. Zelensky is not a Nazi. By the way, Mr. Zelensky was not part of the quote-unquote coup d'etat from 2014. He won a free and fair election in 2019. And he won almost every single region, Ollie, just so everybody understands. This is not, sometimes I hear it's a divided country. He won everywhere but a few places, to Mr. Poroshenko, out in the West. So remember that before we get to that other part. When he says denazification and demilitarization, what I think is going to happen, and I think it's already happening, watching my Twitter feed and my various platforms I'm on right now, is that the Russians are attacking military installations. They have air superiority, so they're going to do that first before anything else happens. But denazification in Putin language, in his lingo, that means the collapse of the Kiev government. I don't see there's any other way to understand that. Now, how he does it, how he thinks he's going to pull that off, I don't know what his plan is, but that is most certainly the objective that he has stated for this military operation.
It's 10 minutes to 7 a.m. in Kyiv, and what we're showing on the left side of the screen now is a highway, a major route in which people are leaving the city now. You can see that. You can see some sirens and lights, but you're now seeing remarkable traffic out of Kyiv. Ambassador, are you able to shed some light on this denazification stuff and why Vladimir Putin thinks that would be useful to talk about and who is susceptible to it? Because I remember in 2014, there was also an effort to undermine the opposition to the then pro-Russian government by saying that they're anti-Semites and they're Nazis. What's the provenance of this discussion?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's when he started using the phrase Nazis supported by NATO, right? The two N-words, as we called it back in 2014. And there is, to remember, there is a history of some Ukrainians fighting on the Nazi side because they were occupied by the Soviet Union. Let's remember, they considered themselves a colony, but a very small group. One should not, exaggerate it. But he is pulling on that string, right? He's pulling on that thread from history to say that what you had was a neo-Nazi usurpation of power in 2014. That's what he said in his rambling speech from 2 days ago when he went on for an hour to explain and justify it. And he's appealing to Russians. He's trying to explain this to Russians. And, again, we've seen the polling. The majority support him. Majority support these independent republics becoming independent countries. There's some alleged reporting on polling on that, but a couple of things to remember. One, polling in authoritarian countries is hard to do. What incentive does anybody have to tell you what they really think? When Ivan Ivanovich calls you up on the phone from Moscow and says, hey, I'm doing polling here. What do you think of Putin? What do you think of this operation? You have no incentive to tell the truth. So everybody needs to be cautious about that. Again, I interact with Russians every single day. I don't see any enthusiasm for this war. Like, why are we attacking them? He tells us we're from the same nation, but we're attacking these Nazis. And the Nazi leader, allegedly, is this guy Zelensky. And I want to remind everybody, Zelensky's first language was Russian. We had a long conversation about it when he visited me here last August. He was a very popular television personality in Russia, okay? And so when it's hard for Russians to look at Zelensky and say he's a Nazi, and that's why I think Putin needs this argument. That's who he's appealing to. He needs a justification for this incredibly unjustified war, not for us, but for his own people back home.
But if the goal is to cause people to fear what was an expansionist Germany in the late 30s, the interesting part about this, which I heard you bringing up earlier this evening, is it was September 1st, 1939, that under the guise of protecting Germans in Poland, Hitler invaded, and that started World War II.
It did. And by the way, 2 weeks later, Moscow invaded Poland too. So people need to remember that small fact about 1939, that aggression happened on both sides. I just think,
Ambassador, I'm going to ask you to stop for a second. I want to go to Kharkiv. Matt Bradley is there. He's hearing some shelling in the background. Matt, what's going on?
Hey, Ali, we are hearing some shelling right now in the background. It's actually behind the camera. We're trying to kind of figure out where it is.
I can hear it.
I'm not sure if you can hear it. It still sounds pretty distant. But it's ongoing. Again, though, Ali, this city, you just don't get the same impression as my colleague Eric McLaughlin was saying. You don't get the same impression that people are fleeing. We're starting to see public transportation working. It's dawn here. Taxis are circulating in the streets. But we are still hearing the distant sound of shelling. This place is a little different. This is eastern Ukraine. People here are a little more ready for war. They're expecting this to happen. And they are Russian speakers. They may have the belief that Vladimir Putin's military won't come in here and attack civilians because they believe that Vladimir Putin believes that this is Russia, that this population here will go with Moscow. So a lot of people here, if people in Kyiv didn't believe that the Russians would ever attack Kyiv, a lot of people here have been living with that reality and that expectation for quite a long time, and they've thought that this wasn't going to be targeted at civilians because Putin sees them as Russians.
What's going on in the streets behind you? There's not as much traffic as I might have assumed for this hour of the morning, but what's happening there? Is the city waking up and operating as normal?
The city is waking up, and as far as I can tell, the city is waking up and operating as normal. I don't see columns of cars leaving. I don't see traffic. I am seeing off to my left here, you can't see it, just a regular bus, a city bus that's operating, slowly lumbering along in the morning, I guess bringing commuters to work. Things seem to be sort of moving as normal. But, it's hard to know how this is going to happen. We're waiting for more information from the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, because we are right over the border from Belgorod. And this is a place where we've already started to see a lot of hardware mustering and a lot of troops mustering. Some of the big items like Sukhoi jets, attack helicopters, battle tanks, and self-propelled howitzers. These things, we're expecting them to come over the border. We did hear one report that we're starting to hear troops coming over the border. Mostly we're hearing that in the far south, in Odessa and Mariupol. But we still need more information. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we're just waiting for more information from the government at this point.
All right, Matt, stand by. And, of course, if you hear anything or see anything, wave your hand and we'll put you right back on. I want to go to Keir Simmons, who's got new reporting in Moscow and Vladimir Putin's decision to begin this incursion. Keir?
That's right, Ali. Well, we've just been speaking to a former Russian official with very close ties to the Kremlin. Now, before I tell you what he told us, I just want to say that I think we need to borrow a phrase from previous terrible European wars, that the fog of war. There will be many elements to this that we will hear in the hours ahead that will turn out not to be true, others that will turn out to be true. That is the nature of a conflict, and this conflict is just getting started. But what I have been told by this former official who's close to the Kremlin is that President Putin made the final decision at 3 a.m. Here in Moscow. It's now just coming up towards 8 a.m. In the morning. President Putin's televised address happened at 5:45 a.m. I'm told that prior or around the decision being made, that President Putin made a number of phone calls to members of his Security Council. So whether that is the case, we will find out, I suspect, in the hours and days ahead. That statement from President Putin, that televised address, it's not clear whether it was live or whether it was recorded. Very likely it was recorded, but then that raises the question, of course, how much earlier was it recorded prior to it being broadcast? Right now, here in Moscow and across Russia on state television and on the main television channels, they are replaying that statement from President Putin, that chilling statement. A couple of things, and I pointed this out earlier, and from that statement I think are worth marking, aside from frankly, what some of it, which is just a kind of televised tirade again, where President Putin once again talks about NATO, as you have mentioned, talks about the denazification of Ukraine, a claim for justification for this action that is without merit, of course. But in that statement from President Putin, there are elements that I think raise eyebrows and perhaps point to what is ahead. He talks directly to the Ukrainian military and says, "I urge you to immediately lay down your arms and go home. All servicemen of the Ukrainian army who comply with this requirement will be able to freely leave the combat zone and return to their families." So that suggests, from what President Putin said there, and I take into account that there's of course an element of psychological warfare, that the Russian military and Russia's leader will be trying to terrify the Ukrainians, but it does suggest from that statement that aside from this air campaign, if you like, that there may be a ground offensive ahead. And in fact, that former Russian official who has close contacts to the presidential administration, I said to him, we are seeing no sign. Richard Engel reporting just a short while ago that he is seeing no sign of any kind of ground offensive, but he said it's coming, it's coming. So take that as you will. I also asked him, this former official, I asked him, is President Putin directing this himself? And he said yes. That's how it's going. That's not surprising. We know that President Putin makes all the decisions. In the end, he will have had advice from that small clique around him, but ultimately he is the decision maker. And another elements of his televised address, which again, just to reiterate, many Russians will be stunned by and will be waking up and just seeing now another element from that televised address, which is chilling, frankly, is that President Putin refers to Russia's nuclear capability and clearly openly threatens Western leaders. So he says, even after the collapse of the USSR, the loss of a significant part of its nuclear potential, Russia is today one of the most powerful nuclear powers. And he says, no one should, then I think this is a direct message to the West, frankly. In this regard, no one should have any doubt that a direct attack on Russia will lead to defeats and dire consequences for a potential aggressor. So I just will say, Ali, just before this all began, we did hear from French diplomats raising real questions about President Putin's state, saying that the man that they met was different from the past. And that, again, a worrying aspect as Russians wake up to learn that their country, frankly, is at war with Ukraine.
Keir, we're going to stay close to you. Thank you, Keir Simmons, for us in Moscow. It is midnight in the east. It is 8 a.m. in eastern Ukraine, or 7 a.m. in eastern Ukraine, 8 a.m. in Moscow, and we have attacks underway in Ukraine. We have heard the explosion of shells in the capital city of Kyiv, constant explosions of shells. This is video being brought to us from the Associated Press. This is a highway out of Kyiv. Look at the cars on the right side going into Kyiv, very few of them. Look at all those cars that are leaving Kyiv right now. Our reporter on the ground there, Erin McLaughlin, has heard shelling. She was on air with us when she heard that shelling. This is unusual because it seems like a second phase in something that just began a few hours ago. As you heard Keir say, we have not seen the rolling over of tanks or artillery over the eastern border of Russia into Ukraine. But there are two regions in eastern Ukraine that Vladimir Putin has declared independent, and tonight he ordered a special military operation to protect those places. He says that he has requests from the leaders of those two republics that nobody else in the world recognizes as independent for Russian military interference or involvement, and that's why they have sent the activity that they've got going on underway. We have a few things going on that we should tell you about. Airspace has been closed. All civilian airspace in Ukraine is now closed. We have heard some reporting that the bombs that we're hearing drop in and around Kiev may be missiles. Someone in the Ukrainian government had posted that to a social media site. We've not been able to confirm that. As Keir said, these are the moments in which we are in the fog of war. We're not entirely sure what's true or not, but our reporters have heard explosions with their own ears. There are reports, Courtney Kube had suggested that the U.S. intelligence had heard that we would start with Russian shelling, perhaps, of military installations and or runways, airports. Ambassador Mike McFaul suggested moments ago that he had been hearing from people in Ukraine that it may be the airports or the area around the airport in Kyiv that is being shelled. I want to go to our two reporters in the region. Richard Engel is in Mariupol, Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine. Erin McLaughlin is in Kyiv. Erin, last we left you a few moments ago, you were hearing fairly constant shelling. What's the story now?
Yeah, we've been hearing missile strikes, cruise and ballistic missile strikes. That, according to an advisor to the Minister of Interior. It started in the early hours of the morning. The last 30 minutes, though, have been comparatively quiet. We are seeing a stream of traffic of cars leaving the city, and we are hearing reports that people here waking up to these explosions are evacuating the capital of Kyiv. We have just heard from the Ukrainian president in a statement that he posted to social media, say that Russia has attacked military infrastructure and the border control in many Ukrainian cities, noting that people can hear explosions. He also announced that he is imposing martial law to the whole state. He says, quote, "Today we need each and every one of you to stay calm and stay at home if you can. We are working, the army is working, all sectors of defense and security of Ukraine is working," continuing with a common theme, trying to keep people calm, trying to keep people from panicking in what is, and there we go. I've just heard the first siren has just gone off. And I've been told by city officials that that indicates that this is a city under attack. That, again, is the first time we have heard sirens in the capital, Kyiv.
I just want to hold on there for a second, because you've been hearing explosions now for a couple of hours, and we were asking about these sirens. You said they'd been tested. Let's just listen. The sirens are now underway in Kyiv. The sirens are sounding to indicate that the city of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is under attack. We have had reports of missiles and explosions. Let's listen for a moment. All right, those are the sirens we had been listening for. Aaron, stand by for a second. I want to go to Richard. There we go. There's the sirens again. Aaron, we had
been wondering, Ali.
Go ahead.
Yes. No, we had been wondering why we hadn't heard sirens. We all heard the explosions. We were wondering where the sirens were. I've been told by city officials that they had tested this system earlier in the week. They said it was working, and now, hours into this attack, we are now hearing this siren system alerting people that this attack is underway. Ali.
It is a remarkable development. I want you to stay with us. This is a picture the Associated Press is showing us. This is the traffic leaving Kyiv now. These are all the people. Aaron's been telling us that for days and weeks there have been people who have been preparing in different ways for something that looked like an attack, but clearly a lot of people hadn't left. Aaron, what's the level of preparation that you were familiar with that people had undergone? You told me about parents who were sending their kids to school with their blood type signified in case they needed blood transfusions. What else have you heard?
Yeah, no, people have been preparing for the worst. While the government had been downplaying this threat, people were taking the situation extraordinarily seriously in terms of these Western intelligence assessments. People I've been talking to here, they all have their own evacuation plans, their own plan B. Some people have been sending their children to the western portion of Ukraine, to towns such as Lviv, which are widely seen to be safer portions of the area because they're closer to the Polish border. People have been stocking up on foods and water, that kind of thing. But really deep down, I would say, in talking to Ukrainians, there was a certain level of skepticism that things would ever reach this point. And that's why I think a lot of people here in Ukraine are waking up completely stunned that their country is at war with their Russian neighbor.
That is remarkable. Aaron, please stand by. I want to go to southeastern Ukraine, to NBC chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. Richard, President Zelensky and President Biden have spoken already, and President Zelensky has made some decisions tonight.
So President Zelensky, as Aaron was just talking about, issued a video statement. It almost looked like a selfie that he took at his desk, in which he said that martial law is being imposed all across Ukraine. He didn't describe exactly what that martial law would entail, but he told people to stay calm, to stay in their homes. And he said that military installations and border posts had been attacked after Vladimir Putin announced the start of special military operations, but that he went on to assure the people that the government is still with them, that the government will stay in contact, and that the security services are on top of the situation. There does seem to be, as I was saying earlier, a psychological component of all of this. And some of these very early phases may be designed to get people to leave the cities, to create that panic, to create those long lines of traffic that you're seeing out of Kiev, because there were reports of beach landings here in Mariupol. We're not seeing them. There were reports of beach landings in Odessa, also not being reported by witnesses, not along the scale of anything like the Russian state news agencies are describing. The Russians also just put out a short time ago a report that the military infrastructure of Ukraine is being destroyed, but that civilians would not be harmed. So it seems that the Russian narrative is trying to soften the population, to appeal to the people to surrender without a fight, to appeal to the military to surrender without a fight, because what is being described by the Russians and what we're seeing at this moment don't correspond.
Richard, talk to me about Mariupol, because it's going to become important. We've heard Matt Bradley talk about when there might be troop movements or when we might see people come across the border. You're on the water. There are a whole different set of defenses or offensive weaponry and techniques that the Russians have all through the southern coast of Ukraine.
So according to the Pentagon, Russia has 10 warships with Marines on board currently in the Black Sea. We are on the Sea of Azov, on the coast of the Sea of Azov, which is connected to the Black Sea. We can see ships in the distance, but they are not firing, they are not at war, they appear to be normal commercial ships. So any kind of naval battle off the Sea of Azov, as far as I can see from where I'm looking at the water, looking at ships right now, is not underway. If there was going to be a beach landing, it could happen all along this southern coast. But as of now, there are no air raid sirens here. There is traffic in the streets. We saw some police cars and ambulances moving with their sirens blaring, but it wasn't clear if they were responding to any particular incident. Although now, as we're speaking, I just heard one, sounded like one explosion.
I heard that
it may
too.
have been two, or that first one could have been the reverberation of the first explosion. That is the first loud and clear explosion that we have heard since this operation began. So we will see how that develops.
Yeah.
But that was on the outskirts of Mariupol. I'm right in the center now. That sounded like it was a few miles away at the very least. So we will continue to monitor
I heard that as you were speaking. We could hear that out here. That whatever it was loud. Richard, stay close as you get more. Just let us know. Richard Engel, NBC News chief foreign correspondent, who is in Mariupol, Ukraine. Aaron McLaughlin is in Kyiv for us. I'm just going to ask my executive producer where she wants me to go. Mike Memoli is in Washington, D.C. Mike, you were reporting to us that you and your colleagues had heard that the president was talking to Volodymyr Zelensky. Now we have heard that Volodymyr Zelensky has released a video of himself talking about the fact that there is going to be martial law. We're hearing explosions. We're hearing sirens in Kyiv. We're hearing, as you just heard with Richard Engel, an explosion in Mariupol. What is happening in the White House?
We just got a new statement, Ali, from the White House on the president's call with President Zelensky, and I'll just read it to you directly. He says, it's interesting, Ali, having read so many of these foreign leader readouts, I will stay at the front, the sort of more casual language in this president's statement, which I think speaks to how quickly they wanted to get this out. President Zelensky, Biden says in this statement, reached out to me tonight, and we just finished speaking. I condemned this unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. I briefed him on the steps we are taking to rally international condemnation, including tonight at the United Nations Security Council. Biden saying that Zelensky asked me to call on the leaders of the world to speak out clearly against President Putin's flagrant aggression and to stand with the people of Ukraine. Tomorrow, I will be meeting with the leaders of the G7 and the United States, and our allies and partners will be imposing severe sanctions on Russia. That statement there making explicit what was implied by the earlier White House statements tonight, that the president will be, as promised, escalating beyond the sanctions that he had announced just about 31 hours ago, Ali, at this point. It was interesting. We had been hearing all along, this is now really almost 3 months in which the White House has been promising swift and severe sanctions on Russia if it were to go ahead with the invasion. At the earliest indications of that invasion, a little over 24 hours ago, they took that initial step, the banking sanctions, the sanctions on Russian oligarchs, the severing of Nord Stream 2, essentially. Now the White House and the president explicitly in this statement saying they will indeed go further now that Vladimir Putin has gone further. And we'll wait and see and try to work our White House sources to see if they'll be able to share what exactly those sanctions might be. We have some indication of what was on the table, sort of export controls, trying to limit Russia's ability to get imports, critical imports from the West, from the United States for its manufacturing sector, for instance, potentially even sanctions on Putin directly. But we won't get ahead of what the White House has planned at this point.
But we are going to hear from the White House. We're going to hear from the president after he's had the conversation with the G7 leaders.
That's right. That's right. The president speaking tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with his G7 counterparts. And then in the early afternoon was what the White House has told us at this point. The president will address the nation.
All right. It's still more than 8.5 hours away. That means markets are not open yet. I will tell you, though, that market futures are looking not very good right now. We're looking at an opening, and there's much to happen tonight, so it's a little early to talk about it. But all major markets are looking to be 2% lower right now. We've seen a spike in the price of oil as well. Brent crude oil has now topped $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. We'll keep a close eye on that as well. I want to bring in CNBC's Hadley Gamble, who's on her way to Moscow right now and has just spoken with the Ukrainian foreign minister. Hadley, what have you heard?
Thanks so much for having me, Ollie. So essentially, I was speaking to Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, on the tarmac. He was en route from Washington to Istanbul, where he's going to have to take a car, essentially, to get into Kiev from a third-party country because Kiev, of course, has cut all flights. He told me this: we are calling for the fierce isolation of Russia. This is an attack on the world order. He's also saying that Ukraine is calling on the United States, the West, to immediately implement heavy sanctions. That would include immediate disconnection of Russia from the SWIFT system. They say that they need more financial assistance, more heavy weaponry in Ukraine at this point. But I've been speaking to this man several times since December, and the message has always remained the same. If you don't implement sanctions ahead of an invasion will happen, and it looks as if that is exactly what has occurred. Now, he did tell me in terms of what happened, a timeline. He said 5 minutes after President Putin announced his intentions, we saw heavy artillery and rockets flying toward major cities, including the capital city of Kyiv. He said, of course, we've observed a ground invasion already in the direction of Kharkiv. And he said, I can tell you right now that heavy fighting is happening. And as I told you previously in many interviews that I've had with this gentleman, the Ukrainians plan to fight for themselves. They've already been issued weapons from the government. The civilians have said they are ready to fight for their country. So this is a country, frankly, Ollie, that's up in arms. And as you mentioned, the market, the U.S. Open is looking to go 2% lower. But I have to tell you, the Asia markets have already been reacting to this story. As you mentioned, oil over $100 a barrel, popping above $100 a barrel. This is significant because the White House, Western powers declined to sanction the energy sector. And there's a reason for that, because this wouldn't just hit the gas sector, this would hit oil prices. And you've got to remember that when it comes to oil prices, the United States at the end of last year took 7% of their oil from Russia. So this would not only hit European powers, this would hit the United States.
It's exactly why it took a while before all the NATO countries were on board with some of these sanctions. It's why it took a while before Germany decided to cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because the fact is the world relies on a lot of the energy that it gets from Russia. Hadley also talking about the Ukrainians calling for the removal of Russia from the SWIFT system. That's a Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transactions. That's how world trade is done. If you can't be on the SWIFT system, anybody who's ever sent a wire, you know exactly what that is. If you can't be on the SWIFT system, you can't trade with the world. Let's go to Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, where those sirens continue to blare as a warning that Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine, is under attack. Aaron McLaughlin is there for us. Aaron?
Hi, Ali. Well, you can hear the siren sounds behind me. We have yet to hear further explosions. The sirens seeming to indicate that this capital is under attack. They had been preceded by hours of explosions, but it has been a while since we have heard the booms, the kind of booms that woke up so many citizens here in the capital in the small hours of the morning. According to an advisor to the Interior Minister, cruise and ballistic missiles had been launched on the capital, striking military installations and airfields. No indication so far that civilian targets have been hit, but civilians did say they woke up, some of them to their windows being rattled by the sounds of these explosions. It's absolutely terrifying and surreal to be standing here on this balcony, Ali, in a flak jacket in the Ukrainian capital. Many here just simply did not think it would come to this, but this is the situation they are now in. We have heard from President Zelensky urging people to remain calm, urging people not to panic. In a social media post that he posted to Facebook, it was a kind of a selfie video that he took. It's unclear where he is at this hour. I was speaking to his spokesperson just a short while ago. He declined to comment any further than what the president had posted on his Facebook. But again, he was urging people to remain calm. But he did say that a martial law will now be implemented here in the capital. Just yesterday, Parliament voted to approve a state of emergency, meaning that we'll see checkpoints here in the city, as well as a number of restrictions imposed on people living in the capital, a ban on mass gatherings, also extraordinary powers to police to be able to stop citizens and check their papers, that sort of thing. But now another layer of martial law has been announced on top of that. Ali.
Aaron, thank you. We'll stay close to you. Aaron McLaughlin is in Kyiv, where there are sirens. I want to go back to Ambassador Michael McFaul. We were having an interesting discussion, and then all of this news broke about explosions and martial law. Aaron makes an interesting point. We know that Zelensky and President Biden were talking. We know that the U.S. Embassy staff has relocated to western Ukraine. And I don't know whether Zelensky's involved in this or not, but we've been hearing intelligence reports that there's a plan to get Zelensky out of Kyiv if that needs to happen. What happens now when the capital city of Ukraine is actually under attack?
It's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I'm literally been corresponding for 2 hours now with people in Kyiv, including people in the government, just so we're clear, not revealing any names. But right now, they're ready for war. They're not leaving. They're not thinking of evacuation. They're going to stand their ground. That obviously can change. I think it's just really important for us to keep reminding ourselves how quickly things can change. Just 2 hours ago, we were talking about how everything's quiet on the streets of the major cities. Now that's totally different. Look at what you're showing right now, Ali. Not a single soul is on the main street of Kyiv. I've been on that street 100 times. This time in the morning, that place is usually packed. So just remember, it's a fast-moving story that we need to understand and keep updating as best we can. But I think, you know, the people I'm talking to, they're preparing for war. They're scared. They're nervous. They've sent their children, by the way. They've sent their families, their older, elderly people already to places like Lviv. But most people are bracing for war. They're also talking about, by the way, that they don't have enough civilian defense to do that. One of the calls I was on today a few hours ago saying silly things, not silly things, but pretty pedestrian things like knee pads, which you need to shoot a gun. There's no knee pads. And so those are the kinds of things just everyday Ukrainians are thinking about in terms of preparing for what I think will be a pretty disastrous next hours and days and weeks to come.
I want to put up a map that shows the NATO countries that are in that region. There are a lot of discussions about what the rest of the world can do for Ukraine, but Ukraine is not a member of the world's biggest military alliance, and that is NATO. So at the moment, there are no discussions of NATO troops or U.S. troops going into Ukraine to help. You believe and have said for some time, Ukraine needs massive military assistance. What does that look like? Can you send enough stuff? Do they have enough people trained to use it? If there aren't going to be U.S. troops, if there aren't going to be European troops going into NATO, what does military assistance look like now?
First, it's a little late now. Months ago, I was writing that, more air defense systems are needed. Patriots. They don't have any Patriots. Stingers. They don't have enough Stingers. That's a weapon that was used in Afghanistan, as you remember. They literally don't have they want more Stingers. And I could go through a long list. I'm not a military expert, but we should have done more, and we need to do more now. Number one. Number two, it is right. We're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. The president has made that clear. I think it is, however, incumbent on the president and the NATO alliance to take the necessary actions to make crystal clear that any attack on any one of our NATO allies will be an attack on all. There's something called the NATO Response Force, the NRF, It hasn't mobilized yet, Ali. I mean, why is that? Well, you know, it was designed to do exactly this, and it was upgraded, by the way, in 2014. We haven't had, you know, consensus in the alliance. That's what I've been told by my friends in the government. Well, now it needs to be mobilized, because the worst thing that can happen from our perspective is that, you know, what if the Ukrainian military begins to get routed? And what if they run? What if they go into Poland to survive? Right? Remember Dunkirk? Sometimes military commanders make decisions that in order to fight for another day, you have to retreat now. We need to be prepared for those kinds of contingencies. And the last thing I just need to say, you know, this is a pretty dramatic, emotional day for me personally. I have hundreds of friends in Ukraine. We've trained 200 Ukrainians here at Stanford over the decades. It's the right decision. I support the president, but I got to tell you, I'm hearing from many Ukrainians right now. I can't believe that we now have to fight Vladimir Putin alone. And they feel alone at this very horrible, tragic moment in the history of their country.
I have to ask you, because you've been talking to people there, about the sirens. You know, we hadn't heard them all night, and we were wondering about that because Erin was saying that she had heard explosions, and then we heard them. That is a chilling matter for people who have not been in a war zone or have not been in a city where they've heard that. To hear sirens going off because your city is under attack makes that very, very real for our viewers, for the world.
It was. I listened to it with you. It was very chilling. Those are for civilian defense, right? So when you hear things like that, you're supposed to go to bomb shelters. And in Kiev, that means like metro stations, for instance, or places like that. I'm not a general, although I talk to them pretty much every day. I think we're still in the early phases where they're trying to wipe out Ukraine's military defenses, right? Remember what Putin said a couple hours ago. He said, we're going to demilitarize Ukraine and then we're going to do denazification. So I still think we're in that early phases where they're still attacking military targets. But I don't want to second guess what Mr. Putin is going to do next. That we know he's doing now, and you know, my Twitter feed, my social media, my emails I'm looking at right now, Ali, it's all about people from all over the country, not in the far west. People from Lviv, just so you know, that I'm hearing from, they are not under attack right now. But in the rest, in the major cities, people are hearing attacks and preparing for further attacks.
Ambassador, thank you, and we're going to keep you close. You did mention you're not a general, but I got a general right now. I want to bring in the retired four-star U.S. Army General Barry McCaffrey. General McCaffrey, I mean, important to note that we've been hearing these explosions in Kyiv, and Mike McFaul suggests that some of them might be in the area of the airport. When it comes to airports, civilian airports are the same as military installations in some places, and that is something Courtney Kube said that the U.S. expects, that the Russians may try and endanger airports. They may try and ruin runways so that the defense systems are neutralized.
Yeah, well, look, this is simply not shock and awe. This
is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Llamas.
And good evening. We are coming on the air with breaking news. Ukrainians are waking up to the sounds of explosions and emergency sirens. Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine is underway. Officials there say missile strikes, troop landings, and shelling across the country has begun. Ukraine has declared martial law, and one of the first and most telling images of this crisis is the line of bumper-to-bumper traffic. You see it right there. This is to leave, or rather to escape, the capital city. Russian forces are spread along nearly every border. Russian President Vladimir Putin going on television overnight announcing the attack and telling Ukrainian forces to lay down their arms. I want to get right to Kiev and Erin McLaughlin, who's been reporting there for us all night. Erin, what's the latest?
Hi, Tom. Well, we have heard the first sounds of sirens here in the capital, alerting people that the city is under attack. This was preceded by hours of booms in all directions from where I'm standing now. The last explosion that we heard was just about 50 minutes ago, according to an advisor to the Minister of the Interior. Ballistic and cruise missiles struck a number of locations, including airfields as well as military headquarters. No civilian structures struck so far. As far as we know, we have heard from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a statement, video statement that he posted to social media, saying that Russia has attacked our military infrastructure and our border control in many Ukrainian cities. We are imposing martial law for the entire country. Tom.
All right, Aaron McLaughlin, part of our team reporting out of Ukraine tonight. Aaron, you stay safe. President Biden tonight speaking with Ukraine's president and saying the world will hold Russia accountable. Our coverage continues on MSNBC and NBCNews.com for full coverage tomorrow, always on Today. I'm Tom Yamas, NBC News, New York.
Leaving Kyiv right now, you can't go east because that's where the danger is. You can't go north because that's where the danger is. You're indicating they're probably going west, closer to Lviv, a lot more Polish influence on that side, and very close to a NATO country.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, there's a substantial number of Russian combat units, 110 combat battalions around the east and the north. So we should expect at some point a relatively unopposed advance by the Russians from Belarus down to encircle Kiev. I wouldn't think there's going to be street-to-street fighting. And I don't think civilian militias, grandmothers and young people with an hour instruction on an AK-47 are actually going to try and stand up to Russian armor, supported by self-propelled artillery. So, you know, the poor Ukrainians have 125 combat aircraft. That's nothing. They'll be eliminated before the substantial assault begins. Some of those Ukrainians actually may go into Belarus. Belarus is a brother nation. They're already under the heel of Putin. So, but very soft beginning to this whole assault. The big battle is coming. It's in the east to eliminate the Ukrainian armed forces in the line of contact.
General, thank you for your analysis. It's all going to become very, very important as we watch this unfold. General Barry McCaffrey, I want to go to Andrea Mitchell, NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent. Courtney Kube standing by as well, NBC News Pentagon Correspondent. Andrea, everything that the administration has told us was going to unfold has unfolded this way. Even the president of Ukraine had suggested that the U.S. was being hysterical and overstating what was going to happen. But it's all happening right now. So given the intelligence that the United States has and the power that it's got within the G7 and NATO, what does the U.S. do next? We'll hear from the president at 9 tomorrow morning. But what do you think's happening?
Well, he's already told President Zelensky in the call that President Zelensky initiated within the last hour as to the president's statement. He says that he told him what he is doing at the United Nations and told him he's going to be talking to the G7 tomorrow and that there will be more tough sanctions against Russia. That said, take this back a moment to earlier this evening, 9:30 tonight, when the Ukrainian ambassador challenged the Russian ambassador who was leading as president until March 1st. He's the president of the Security Council, and demanded that he be replaced as leading the session because his government had just announced that he was attacking Ukraine's government. I mean, it was a very fierce argument. And that tells you everything about the UN and about the Security Council, because the Security Council overwhelmingly the General Assembly today overwhelmingly supported Ukraine, and there were very strong statements. But the Security Council, Russia has a veto. China has a veto. China's not going to want Russia to be, sidelined here. They're likely going to support, at least not the invasion, but support Russia and Russia's initiative. But in any case, Russia has a veto. So there will not be any UN action. What will the president do? The president's going to talk to the G7 about more sanctions. And presumably NATO will now have a meeting of what they call the North Atlantic Council, which is the decision-making military unit, and they will order those troops. There are 8,500 American troops who are on very short standby. They can now go to be part of a NATO rapid defense force. But that force will go to Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, the frontline NATO states, and they will not cross into Ukraine. So the military help for Ukraine that is still flowing in will go to the regular army, the 150,000 that are mostly in the east. There will be an insurgency, there will be a defense, but so far, everything the U.S. intelligence laid out has been spot on.
Yeah.
And that means that they expect that the third wave of this will be the tanks coming down those highways towards Kyiv from Belarus. They've already presumably been landing or can land from the ships, 10 to 12 warships at sea in the Black Sea. So Ukraine is surrounded.
Yeah.
And they'll start in the east, they'll move west, and they're going to try to topple this government. Zelensky could go into exile in Poland, but this is going to be a very long slog because Putin, according to most military analysts, has now, with his conventional forces, can claim Kyiv and try to topple the government. But this is going to be a very long slog because these people are going to fight like hell.
Let's put up the map of NATO because I want to ask you about this. Ukraine, as we see it on the map, you can see that Belarus north of it, which is not a NATO nation, it's pro-Russian. There are Russian troops all along that northern border of Ukraine with Belarus, and then all along the northeast, the east, and the southeast with Ukraine. Ukraine is not just surrounded, but the south, the Sea of Azov and west of Crimea, is also got, the Caspian's also got a Russian Navy and troops.
Well, the Russian Navy basically controls the access there because they've had those warships, they've got landing ships. And what you've been hearing so far is likely, according to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, them trying to take out airports and other military infrastructures. And so they will control the air as well. Very clearly, they've got S-400s in Belarus, and they, control the airspace. The commercial aircraft have stopped running, according to the European Union. So Russia has them surrounded, and they have a much larger conventional force with up to 190,000 troops that we've been reporting. And there are reports, I haven't confirmed this, I haven't seen this from the Defense Ministry, there are reports that the Belarus army, those troops are also lined up with the Russians. That would not be at all surprising, given the way that they've been doing joint military exercises and what has been happening there in Belarus. So you've got a really large conventional force, and there's no question that Russia has the edge here militarily, but they are not going to win the hearts and souls of the Ukrainians. And they took on Afghanistan, and look at how that went for them.
Yes, which is
their withdrawal from Afghanistan, their defeat there was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the Russian population is
Vladimir Putin.
The one thing about people around the world is not everybody's interested in their government getting involved in long, drawn-out wars. Obviously, by the way, as you said correctly, it's the Black Sea, not the Caspian Sea. Getting a little late in the night for me, but it's not so late that Secretary Blinken has just tweeted out, Andrea, that the Defense Secretary and I spoke with Jens Stoltenberg to condemn Russia's attack on Ukraine and to discuss the alliance's coordinated response. We are united in responding to Russia and strengthening NATO's eastern flank. So NATO's eastern flank, as it relates to Ukraine, is mostly Poland, but it's those countries that you named, the Baltic states, are very deeply concerned about this. They all have large Russian populations, sometimes in excess of 20%, and they're very worried about this thesis that Vladimir Putin has, that Russians anywhere else require the umbrella of protection of Russia. It reminds them of what Hitler did in 1939 as an excuse to go into Poland. So these NATO countries that are already fully NATO are very worried about this.
Of course they are. They're on the front line, and who knows if this will stop with Ukraine. So what are Vladimir Putin's ambitions? All we know so far is that he wants to control Ukraine and claims that that is part of Russia. But we don't know how far he's going to go, and that is precisely why they were so eager to join NATO. They wanted that, Article 5 treaty protection, and were even more eager to join the EU because they wanted the economic, benefits of joining the EU. But of course, there are those, Tom Friedman in yesterday's New York Times, criticizing the NATO expansion, saying that at the moment where the Soviet Union had collapsed and where Russian pride was, people were were being ground down, and people like Vladimir Putin, of course, were grieving for the fall of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, where he had been in charge of the KGB in East Germany for so long. But that was the worst time to then begin reaching NATO expansion, because that was ending any hope that Russia and the United States and NATO could ever work peacefully together. I'm not sure I agree with that.
Well, doesn't that ignore
the
the will of the people in those countries that couldn't turn
Exactly.
fast enough to the West and wanted the prosperity and democracy that the West brings? They could have chosen to stay with Russia. They didn't want to.
Well, in fact, the fall of the Berlin Wall was the most graphic example in history of the differing economic systems between East and West. You had Angela Merkel growing up in the East and immediately going to the West and valuing the education and you know, the life of the West, even though she had spent her whole life in the East. And she's just one individual. It was apparent to the whole world. And it was, in fact, in those early years after the end of the Soviet Empire, where we saw so much of a move towards capitalist instincts and toward the perestroika that Gorbachev had envisioned and that was carried out by some of his successors. But so much of it then became crony capitalism for the enrichment of the Vladimir Putins of this world and the oligarchs who are now being punished in these sanctions. But the sanctions will not touch Vladimir Putin and his progeny.
No.
They are so well protected. According to a lot of U.S. intelligence, he may be the richest man in the world.
It may hurt Russians. It may not hurt Vladimir Putin.
Exactly.
Andrea, I'm kind of fascinated that you're still talking to me, because I don't know what your last 96 hours. I've spoken to you in all sorts of parts of the world. You have been nonstop, so I appreciate you continuing to bring me your very important analysis right now. Andrea Mitchell is NBC News' chief foreign affairs correspondent. Courtney Kube is NBC News' Pentagon correspondent. And I have to say, Courtney, this has started to unfold the way you narrated it for me at 9 p.m. This evening. The things you said were going to happen, including, and surprisingly to me, not to you, what seems to be attacks on what might be an airfield or an airport near Kyiv. You had said they might intend to pock the runways so that those few aircraft military aircraft that Ukraine has can't work.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the ultimate goal of this initial part of the invasion, of the kinetic phase of this invasion, is to stop the Ukrainian Air Force and Ukrainian military from mounting any kind of a response or defense, really, and especially any kind of a coordinated defense. So the ways you do that is you stop the Air Force from responding. Literally damaging, blowing up parts of the runway can cripple an Air Force, depending on what kind of assets they are. They'll also try to take out some of those air assets, most likely. Then also take out some of the air defenses. So when Russian aircraft are flying over, the Ukrainian military doesn't have the ability to take those aircraft out of the sky. In addition to that, one of the ways that you really isolate a military is you cut them off regionally. So you stop them from being able to communicate with one another, and then you also stop them from being able to physically reach one another. So that includes taking out some of their equipment, their ammunition depots, their vehicles, their command and control. One of the messages that we got from the Ukrainian government a couple of hours ago was that they were going after the Russians were going after Ukrainian military control centers. That is what the U.S. military might call their command and control centers. So they're really trying to stop the Ukrainian military from mounting any kind of a coordinated defense in advance of the Russian military physically moving across those borders. Another thing that we've been expecting to see, and we're hearing from the Ukrainian government that is happening, is cruise missile strikes. So the Russian military already had dozens of missile assets all around that country. But the one that was particularly concerning to U.S. intelligence officials in recent days were those ships that the Russian military brought into the Black Sea and then into the Sea of Azov. They're landing ships, yes, they have the ability to bring mainly Russian Marines, but Russian military ashore there. But they also have missile capability, and those are among some of the Russian military's most precise capabilities for targeting from afar.
So this is an interesting point, because we have had discussions about the Ukrainian military and how fierce they are and how enthusiastic they are, but this is almost like asymmetric warfare, right? When you're talking about missiles, when you're talking about the sheer number of troops, when you're talking about the Russian-trained army, their warships in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, doesn't really matter how enthusiastic the Ukrainian defense is. They're not a match for a ground game with the Russians.
Yeah, and the Ukrainian military really has grown and expanded by leaps and bounds since just 2014. And that's come in part because they have had training from a lot of allies, including the United States. And they've also had weapons systems, all kinds of different, even non-lethal aid that the United States and other allies, the British, the French, have provided to them in those years. But the reality is the Russian military just dwarfs them, both in size, in capability. The Russians have hypersonic missile capabilities. They have advanced 4th and 5th generation fighter aircraft. So the Ukrainian military has grown in these last 8 or so years, but the Russians just have grown faster. The reality is the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people are likely to mount a defense here, and it will probably be bloody against the Russian military. But at the end of the day, the Russian military just dwarfs them.
Did any alarm bells go off when Vladimir Putin a few hours ago made reference to the fact that they are a nuclear-armed country? Everybody knows Russia is. But the fact that he brought it up in the process of declaring military action in Ukraine struck me as unusually aggressive.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ali. And I actually asked people about that because, most likely when he's saying things like that, it's a message of deterrence, right? It's to say, look, I'm drawing this line. This is a capability that we have. And in case anyone's forgotten, I'm going to remind you about it. There have been some other recent deployments that have also been similar sort of deterrent messages from Vladimir Putin. He has sent some bombers. There are reports that he has some attack fighters in Syria, which is meant to be a very specific deterrent to the United States military. If there's any sense that the U.S. military is going to go in, he has those capabilities all over the area. Also, there are reports that he sent some of these hypersonics, what some military experts call super missiles, into Kaliningrad. We spoke about that earlier. Those hypersonic missile systems have the ability to hit every European capital. So if ever there was something that was saying, look, Vladimir Putin has laid out what he wants to do here in a number of different ways, both in this speech, in previous speeches, in this long written op-ed that he wrote back in July and released publicly. He has made it very clear what he wants to do here. He is also now sending signals, clear signals, but with things like these hypersonic missiles and these bomber deployments, to the world and to Western allies and to NATO and to the NATO alliance that, look, I'm going after Ukraine. Don't try to stop me. And if you do, these are the capabilities that I have, and that he is making it very clear he is willing to use.
That is remarkable. When he said that, I thought that was something, we've come to expect everything these days, and that one I didn't expect. Courtney, thanks. Stay close, please, and let us know as soon as you've got any more updates. I want to go back to Kyiv. Aaron McLaughlin is standing by. Matt Bradley is in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Keir Simmons is in Moscow. Let's start with Aaron. What's the situation there, Aaron?
Well, we have just heard from the emergency services here in Ukraine posting to the people, to Ukrainians, saying, we ask you to stay calm, not to panic, pack your valuables, warm clothes, and be ready to act accordingly to official orders. Military objects are being shot, and this can cause a threat to the civilian population. The State Security Service, Ukraine, is ready to help you. It has been a while now since we have heard the last explosion. The last explosion we heard was about over an hour ago. The sirens for now also seem to have stopped. People are continuing to evacuate the city here. Although while they're leaving in cars, we're hearing reports that some of the highways in the western direction of Ukraine are now jammed with traffic. But the streets of Kyiv themselves, though, are empty as authorities are trying to urge people to remain calm. We have heard from President Zelensky in a social media post urging people not to panic, and he was urging people to stay home and to stay calm, saying that Ukraine is now under attack. This is a scenario which really the Ukrainian government had been downplaying for some time. As early as the beginning of this week, President Zelensky saying that he did not think that Russia and Ukraine were going to go to war. But this morning, the blasts that woke people in the capital, obviously indicating that war is now very much underway, as we're waiting to hear more from authorities in terms of their next steps. I spoke to the Ukrainian president's spokesperson a short while ago and asked him where the Ukrainian president is. He declined to comment, Ali.
Aaron, have you been able to get, I know you're working hard and you're paying attention to everything that's going on, but we're not sure where, clearly you heard explosions in Kyiv. We were together when you heard them, then you heard the attack sirens. Do we know where those explosions happened yet? And I'm asking you because when I was talking to Ambassador McFaul earlier, he seemed to think that he was hearing from people in Ukraine who thought at least some of them might be near the airport, although you indicated you were hearing them from different directions.
Yeah, I was hearing explosions really at all sides from where I am right now, really in the heart of the capital. I was hearing explosions to my left, to my right, and then directly behind me. Unclear where exactly, precisely those explosions were happening. Of course, we did hear from an advisor to the Minister of the Interior say that ballistic missiles were launched, striking a number of military installations as well as airfields, though we have no further clarity from authorities on specific targets at this time, Ali.
Okay, as soon as you hear about that, please let me know. Obviously, it's militarily significant and important if they're hitting the airports because Ukraine doesn't have a massive air defense capability.
Stay there! Stay down, Shasta! Just stay down!
All right, Priscilla joins us now live in studio. We still don't know the motive for Michelle Tadeo's murder so far, but I do want to talk to you about Mexico's president because it's odd. At times he says he's addressing these killings, but he's also had somewhat of a contentious relationship with the press.
Yeah, Tom. Last year, he actually began hosting these press conferences where he would call out what he deems lies in the media, at times even singling.
There is what looks like the beginnings of some panic buying, but again, the situation here in Kharkiv is remarkably different from where Aaron is in Kyiv, where it seems like you're hearing sirens, where people are flooding out of the city. But there are successive bombings. We haven't heard one in a couple of hours now. But it seems as though we are starting to hear about a ground invasion and engagement with the Russian military. One interesting thing about this was that they're being supported by Belarus, this comment. Of course, they're coming from the Belarusian side as well. But it sounds as though they're being supported by Belarus. And that's an interesting little detail here, and one that I think is going to become very relevant in the coming days, because Belarus and its president Lukashenko have been so close with Vladimir Putin, so cooperative, and now we're starting to really see the effects of that, with Belarus being used as a staging ground for part of this operation. And, Belarus, ever since the late 1990s, they've had kind of a deal to create what's been called a union state, sort of Vladimir Putin's effort to try to sort of reconstitute the former Soviet Union. This is one of his ambitions and could be one of the underlying notions of why he's coming into Ukraine, because we keep asking that question, why is he invading Ukraine? And we know, of course, that Vladimir Putin considers the collapse of the Soviet Union, he's said this, to be one of the most, the biggest political disasters of the 20th century. Reconstituting it for him, or at least reconstituting some sort of sphere of influence that would include Belarus and Ukraine. It's one of the motives behind the dramatic actions he's taking this morning.
Yeah, well, when you look at the map and you look at from the Baltics to the Black Sea, only Ukraine is in the way for Russia's purposes. Belarus is not a NATO country. It is strongly in the pro-Russia camp, and this is what is so alarming to those NATO countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and even Estonia. Matt, we're going to come back to you very shortly. If you get a chance to look around and let us know what's going on, we'll come right back to you. I want to go to Moscow now. Keir Simmons is standing by there. He's got some news out of Moscow. Keir, it's morning there. What's happening?
Yeah, it's just coming up to 9 in the morning here in Moscow. The traffic, the streets are just as calm as you might expect. This city, of course, not being targeted the way that multiple cities there in Ukraine are. Russian people waking up to first see that speech by President Putin that happened at 5:45 in the morning, just being replayed again and again and again. It was almost as if the Russian television stations took time to kind of get started and begin their morning news programs, perhaps even many of those journalists wondering what to say, because I can tell you Russians across this country will be stunned. One little piece of news, Ali, we're hearing that the airports inside Russia close to Ukraine, multiple of those airports in the southern area of Russia near Ukraine, those are being closed. I think that's not surprising, to stop civilian aircraft from flying while there is an air campaign taking place close to those airports. And another piece of news from here too on the financial side, Ali. So the Moscow exchange has been suspended after shares dropped heavily. The ruble is frankly in free fall. It's hard to tell you what the value of the ruble is right now, because it's a straight line down against the dollar. And I think this goes to an important question right now for Russians and for President Putin, Ali, and I know I'm on your territory here when we talk about this. What we have been talking about up until now is the potential impact of sanctions. And clearly the markets will be very worried about the uncertainty. What will those sanctions look like? But there's also a question of the uncertainty of a conflict. Once a war is started, you don't know what happens. We definitely don't know how this is going to play out in Ukraine. For the Russian people right now, they're seeing the value of their currency fall. And as you know only too well, the next impact of that is heavy inflation if that continues. So aside from the question of sanctions, what the Russian people are waking up to right now is a heavy impact on their economy. How will that affect their psychology? You're going to have these twin track issues. One is, how is this conflict playing out for President Putin? And on the other hand, what is it doing to the Russian economy? Aside from the sanctions, what will it be doing to the Russian economy? What will it be doing to the value of Russian savings? What impact will that be having on Russian public opinion? President Putin clearly has made the calculation, and the opinion polls have shown that many Russian people haven't wanted this conflict, have hoped this conflict doesn't happen, but President Putin has clearly made the calculation that he can lead his people into this war and that they will support him. But he does have domestic issues to deal with, primarily the economy, the standard of living for ordinary Russians, and that is going to be a challenge for him if the markets continue to react in the way they are in these early hours.
In fact, in 2014 and in years before in Ukraine, that's been the source of so much of the discontent, is people not seeing prosperity. I'm always happy when you wander into this space. I will tell you, European markets are not open yet, but it is looking like we are looking at a more than a 2% drop across the board on U.S. markets, which would be about a 700-point drop on the Dow. But more importantly, the price of oil, the price of gold is soaring. The price of oil is up internationally over $102 an ounce now for Brent crude, almost $97 an ounce for the crude that we use here in the United States. So I guess this is a long way of me asking you, Keir, what's the long game for Vladimir Putin right now? Because you don't know economically how war works out in the short term, and it often isn't good for regular people. But Putin's got something else in mind. He's got empire building in mind here.
Yeah, he has. And we should just mention, when you talk about the price of crude, of course, there is this terrible reality that the higher the price of crude goes, the more money Russia makes, because, of course, it is an energy supplier. But that only goes so far if the currency is taking a beating, frankly, because of the other implications that has for people's savings and for inflation here in Russia. Just in terms of, what is Vladimir Putin's aim here. I think another aspect, we've talked about some of the things he said in that speech in the early hours of the morning here, how he talked about Russia's nuclear capability, how chilling that is to hear him talk about that at a point at which he launches this war in Ukraine, because it's clearly directed at the West, saying, listen, I have nuclear weapons, so be careful what you do in reaction to this. So that is frankly chilling. But also in that speech, he once again talks about NATO. Now, we've said it again and again, and everybody watching will know this. Of course, Ukraine is not part of NATO. So at the same time as launching this conflict in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin once again saying that this is a part of his opposition to NATO. He's not fighting NATO right now. And so to answer your question, I think what his aims aren't clear. Is he trying to bring down the government of Ukraine? That seems pretty likely, pretty clear. What is his plan after that? We simply don't know. Does he plan to try to occupy the country? We simply don't know. We think that seems unlikely, not least because of Russia's experience in Afghanistan. Before America's experience in Afghanistan, of course, Russia had a very negative experience of trying to run Afghanistan. So it seems just hard to comprehend that President Putin's plan might be to try and occupy Ukraine. But of course, the issue would be even if he does manage to bring down the Zelensky government, what is he going to be able to put in its place? These are the kind of unknowns that will be worrying the financial markets around the world this morning, and very much so here in Russia. And these are the kind of questions that you begin to ask as a conflict starts, because you never know how a conflict ends.
You are absolutely right about that, Keir. Thank you for your reporting on this. We're going to stay close to you through the course of this night. It is 1 a.m. In New York. We are here from NBC World Headquarters, and we are looking at a...
It is, Andrew. Now, what that war entails, that's the big question, and that's what we're having to piece together in these minutes as the opening salvos are fired. Just reading a report from our person on the ground in Moscow, something very interesting, and let's think about what Mr. Putin might be doing. So if we look at the map here, we know that Ukrainian intelligence today talked about that the city of Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, about 1.4 million people, was one of Russia's targets. They also said this little town down here called Kherson is the other target. So he said, why would those be the two? This is the port city that empties on to the Black Sea, controls all of this key economic waterway that Putin, if he held this, would be able to squeeze Ukraine in a way that he could essentially economically strangle the country. So if they attack here and if they attack here, the other thing we just heard was explosions in a town called Dnipro, which is right here. So if you draw a line here from Kharkiv to Dnipro, that would be the only thing that the Russian army would have to take. And then this waterway, the Dnieper River, forms a natural boundary. So now Putin could carve off essentially 1/3 of eastern Ukraine and be able to control the river and all of the exports that go down the river into the Black Sea. All of their domestic gas production is here, and this is one of the richest agricultural areas in the world. So if Putin's looking for a prize, Kharkiv, Dnipro, all the way down to Kherson as the forces come up from Odessa, and he owns this part of it. Whether he goes after Kyiv itself, we'll wait and see. Only has about 30,000 troops up here to the north. That's a city of almost 4 million people if you take in the suburbs. So that's a tough thing. But we do know that what Mr. Putin wants is to teach the Ukrainian government a lesson, and if he can, to bring them down and create a puppet government in Kiev.
And tonight we've heard the sound of explosions in Ukraine. Help lay this out for us. What could a military operation look like? What does it include? Attacks on the ground, missiles in the air? What would this actually look like?
Yeah, we don't know, but what we do know is the Russian playbook. So the first thing that you do in a major invasion like this, where you are attacking a country with very capable surface-to-air missile systems, air defense systems, you would send in cruise missiles and surface-to-surface missiles in all those places where they had missiles that could take down your airplanes. Once the skies are clear, then they'll launch more surface-to-surface missiles that are very accurate, could go after critical infrastructure, power plants, things like that, equipment areas, military command and control. Now that you have the skies clear and you have initial air defense taken out, now you can bring in your bombers, you bring in your attack aircrafts, and you pound the Ukrainian army from the air with no ability to defend themselves. At some point, given all the array of military ground forces we see here, Mr. Putin will come into Ukraine in some way with some intent. Again, don't know if he wants to go after Kyiv and bring down the government here, or whether he wants to carve off this eastern part of the country. Remember that this is the rebel-held area of Donbass, but this is not all of the Donbass. All of the Donbass goes way out here. The rebel-held area is only about a third of the Donbass. So if he said, I need to go in and retake the Donbass, he's got some work to do in here. But again, a line from Kharkiv to Dnipro down to Kherson would give him that 1/3 of the country, and maybe that's enough.
And Russia seems to have struck first here. So how can Ukraine respond? Are they prepared militarily to respond to a Russian invasion?
They are much improved. The U.S. and NATO countries have been working with them to improve their military since they were whipped in 2014 by the Russians in the Crimea and in the Donbass. So they've gotten better. The problem is the Russian military has also gotten much better. Over the last 15 years or so, Mr. Putin has put a lot of money into improving the Russian military in a way that makes them a very, very capable military, once again, in sort of reflecting that past glory of the Cold War. That means that the Ukrainians, even though they sort of match up man for man on the ground, it still means that the technological advantages that the Russian army, Russian military, Russian Air Force has really is going to be no match. So will Mr. Putin be able to take large parts of Ukraine? Yes, it may take weeks, it may take months, but eventually he'll be able to do that. What he will not be able to do is be able to hold that territory. You think about it, it takes about 3 to 1 in terms of the number of troops. So if he has 150, 170,000 troops around here, if he's going to even hold this much of Ukraine, he's going to need double or triple that, and he can't afford that. He goes into an election in 2 years from now and can't have body bags coming home from some bloody occupation like he saw in Chechnya. So it's probably going to be a get in, get out. I think we heard that tonight where he says he doesn't want to hold terrain, wants to teach the government a lesson. What that lesson is yet to be seen.
For the Ukrainians' defense, how does the mobilization of reservists help?
Because really what they're going to have to do is fight sort of a militia, an insurgency. So remember we saw insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan that we had to fight. It's actually quite difficult because you have people who believe in the defense of their country, that they've been invaded by a country. They're very proud that the national spirit of Ukraine has grown since the independence in 1991 from Russia. So you have Russians invading and killing Ukrainians, and so what they're going to have to do after they eventually get overrun is to sort of go into the militias and fight a guerrilla war. And that ends up being very, very bloody, not only for the Ukrainians, but eventually for the Russians.
And Colonel, last question here. American troops are overseas right now. What kind of support could they provide Ukraine, and how will they engage?
Zero. It'll be the President Biden has made it very clear that this is not our fight. So Ukraine is not.
We're going to have to see. Nothing has stopped him yet. We're going to have to see what actually ends up doing that. Peter, thank you for that. I want to bring in Ambassador Michael McFaul back into the conversation. He's a former ambassador to Russia. We were just, I was just looking at a Vladimir Zelensky tweet, but it's in Ukrainian and I can't read it, but it does appear. Here, you've indicated that there are things that the West can do. What is Zelensky asking them to do tonight?
Well, obviously, I don't know for sure, but you know, we've been talking a lot tonight about the Russian military versus the Ukrainian military. What would be catastrophic is if the Ukrainian military ran out of weapons, javelins, stingers, artillery shells. Those we probably don't provide, but other things that we can provide, that I think would be a first order ask that he would be seeking. And then, you know, other Ukrainians, as we've been talking about, have said they need the kind of equipment for civilian defense. So I think the first order ask will be to make sure that that military assistance comes in. Second, it should go without saying, but tomorrow we should wake up and see shock and awe economic sanctions. No more targeted sanctions, no more ratcheting up, no more waiting to respond. The full arsenal needs to be deployed tomorrow, and it doesn't mean that that will end Putin's invasion. We've been crystal clear about that for hours now tonight, right? But I think it needs to be a wake-up call for all Russians. And, you know, Ali, I want to say honestly, I used to be for targeted sanctions. I used to always say we should target those close to Putin. The Russian people don't deserve to suffer. But at this moment, there has to be much more pressure on all of Russian society. And I hope that's one of the things that they were discussing in these phone calls.
My executive producer, Lauren Peikoff, who knows how to use the Twitter better than I do, just sent me Zelensky's tweet in English, in which he says, urge to stop Putin, war against Ukraine and the world immediately, building an anti-Putin coalition, immediate sanctions, which you just said, defense and financial support. He also says close the airspace. Now let's talk about this for a second. Close the airspace. Can NATO do that? Can the U.S. do that? Ukraine's not a NATO country, but Ukraine is asking them to do that. What level of sanction, or does that cross the line into war?
Well, most certainly we might have some capability to do that, and others that I've been corresponding with in Ukraine, they're saying to do the same on the seas and in the oceans. And I don't even want to speculate about various scenarios, but they want to see if their ports are going to be closed. They want to see the international community to close off Russian ships. My guess is that the Biden administration will not want to go to that step yet, because that then risks entering into a military conflict with the Russian armed forces, and the president has made it crystal clear that he does not want to do that.
Ambassador, in some fashion, I mean, I think you've been on MSNBC every day in the last couple of months. We've talked so frequently. But as this is happening, as this is unfolding, as we were listening to the sirens go off in Kyiv, as we were hearing the explosions, what's the thing that you think people watching this, Americans, need to understand about what has happened tonight?
Well, first, I think we have to stop, framing Putin as some rational actor that wants to sit down and negotiate about NATO. Ali, I've been saying this for 20 years, that he has a certain ideology. He thinks in different ways than us, and he's risky. He's taken a really risky act today, the riskiest one before, but it's a long legacy. And I think we just need to have a much more accurate understanding of the enemy. And I'm going to call him an enemy that we are dealing with if we are part of the free world. I also think we need to call things good and evil. There's too much of this, fudging, his rational interest versus ours. This is an evil act by an evil man against innocent Ukrainians that do not deserve this. So we need some clarity. There is right and wrong in the world. There is good and evil. Sometimes my country has been part of good and bad things and evil things too. But tonight there is good and evil in the world, and it may not stop here. I think we have just entered. This is the largest war in Europe since World War II. Wars don't end. These kind of scale of wars don't end overnight. And even if Russia wins in the first phase, as you were talking about earlier with one of your guests, they may win in the first phase. They have great asymmetry when it comes to the airplanes and rockets. But Ukraine is not going to be subjugated. They're not going to give up. This is going to be a long, guerrilla war, maybe more passive means. It'll go on for a long time. I actually think it's the beginning of the end of Putin and Putinism. I think this was a catastrophic mistake on his part. He's throwing away decades of achievements in the eyes of the Russian people. But I don't know when that'll happen. I do think that will be the way we'll remember this history. But the last thing I would say is we're just in the first day of a major war. And just think about it, everyone who's listening. Think about the other wars that started this way, where we thought we knew, it's just going to be a small war. We'll all be home by Christmas. It's just going to be, it won't go anywhere else. And I just think we need to be worried and concerned of the fact that this could be, A, a long war inside Ukraine, and B, one that could possibly spread beyond Ukrainian borders.
So we are in an unusual world that is rife with misinformation. There are going to be a lot of people who wake up tomorrow morning, on Thursday morning in America, and they will not have given a lot of thought to Ukraine. It's a distant and abstract place to a lot of Americans, and they will be reading up, and they will see something in which Vladimir Putin has said, maybe my control room has the maps of NATO in 1978 versus NATO now. But they will hear Vladimir Putin's argument and the argument of others that NATO pushed toward Russia. NATO backed Ukraine, NATO backed Russia into a corner. NATO kept taking these countries that were former Soviet republics and turned them into to Western countries, and that is what has provoked this. What is somebody like you to say to that?
First thing I would say is go to the journalofdemocracy.org and read my article about it. Because I got so tired of hearing these arguments, Ollie, that I just wrote it up. First thing everybody should know is that that's his argument today. That's not what he said in 2002 about NATO. Go read it. I just put it in quotation marks from yesterday. He said it'd be fine if Ukraine joins NATO. He was nonchalant about other countries doing it. So that is a myth that he is a justification for this war that he was not talking about before. And I just think we need to lay that to rest. This is not about that. And if you don't believe me, then I want you to go and read every single word that Mr. Putin read to the Russian people. It was about an hour-long speech that he gave 2 days ago. I listened to most of it in Russian. The word NATO didn't come up until like halfway through. It was a rant about why the neo-Nazi coup that took over Ukraine in 2014, backed by the Americans, and he wants to do something about it. And that's what he told the Russian people today. He said denazification. That's what he talked about. He didn't talk about NATO. And let's just be clear, crystal clear. There's no Nazis ruling Kiev today. There has never been. Mr. Zelensky was voted in a free and fair election years after what happened in 2014. But this is much bigger for him. He thinks that he is uniting this country that has strayed away because they had this simple idea that they wanted to have free and fair elections and choose their leaders in free and fair elections and not have people sitting in Moscow tell them what to do. And now he wants them to pay the price. And that's why everybody in the free world that cares about freedom and democracy needs to be standing by Ukraine. And the last thing I'll say on this, it's not just about Ukraine. I think the lesson from history is when you think, oh, faraway place, 1938, what does Czechoslovakia have to do with me? Right. 1939, what does Poland have to do with me? We had many Americans arguing that in 38 and 39. We know what happens later. If we don't take a stand to fight for freedom here, and I don't mean literally, I mean standing with the Ukrainians against this horrific invasion, it'll affect everywhere around the free world, not just in Ukraine.
I want to ask you this one thing, and I want to preface this by saying it shouldn't matter what people's choices are, that if you believe in self-determination, people get to make their own choices. Why is Ukraine different from a lot of its neighboring countries? Why didn't it join NATO earlier? Why did it go back and forth between pro-Russian governments and pro-Western governments? It's had two revolutions in the last 20 years.
Great question. Great question. Because the Ukrainian people, as President Zelensky so eloquently spoke today, and again, I urge your viewers to go listen or read his speech. It was a really powerful speech. Because the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government, didn't want to have war. They didn't want to have conflict with Russia. They tried to have a foot in the east, a foot in the west. Back to the Orange Revolution, Ollie, in 2004, I wrote a whole book about it back then. There was a revolution then, and they didn't say, oh, we're going to join NATO today. They didn't kick the Russian forces out of Crimea. They wanted peace with their neighbors to the east. And it was only after Russia attacked them in 2014 that this conversation about NATO began. If you're there alone, and you've shown those maps many times, you're there alone. You've already been attacked once. You already have lost territory to your neighbor through annexation once. Is it so irrational that you would want to join a security relationship, a NATO an alliance that might protect you from going down that path again? And tragically, that's where the Ukrainians are tonight.
You mentioned the comments made by Volodymyr Zelensky. He is an impassioned and good speaker. He had let out a video. He had released a video earlier today, but we did also hear from a very impassioned delivery from the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations. I want to just play a little of that.
Relinquish your duties as a chair. Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
There's no purgatory for war crimes. They go straight to hell. Earlier, you were saying good and evil. We have to call things for what they are. That was the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations addressing the Russian ambassador, who happens to be the chair of the Security Council because it rotates, and Russia is the acting chair of it right now. I mean, he was sort of saying, he said, call Lavrov right now, relinquish your job, and condemn what your country is doing.
Thought it was a very powerful speech. I hope the rest of the world will hear it. We need to call things good and evil. You know, one of my mentors here at Stanford was a guy named George Shultz. He was Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. And this is before Gorbachev. He used to always talk about this. There are times in the interest of American national security that we have to negotiate. In this case, he was talking about the Soviets. But we don't need to check our values at the door when we do so. We do need to call things when that's black and white and when they're wrong and right and good and evil. And tonight is one of those nights where you have to call things what they are. This is an evil act with unprovoked, peaceful people are being attacked, and we need to stand with them.
I want to ask you about, on Saturday, we saw Vladimir Putin go to a nuclear site and sort of take part in some sort of a demonstration. And then tonight, in his speech to the nation, he talked about the fact that Russia is a nuclear power. Obviously, that's not news to anybody watching this show. Why did he say it?
It was a warning to us. He's trying to say, don't get involved. It was very scary to me. When anybody invokes, we are a nuclear power, that is a very scary statement. And I think, again, to what we were talking about earlier, I think, you know, Mr. Putin is rather unhinged right now. He has been for a long time, in my view, but even more recently, he feels really unhinged to me. His conception of the world is not based in reality, or if it is, he's just lying about it when he talks about it. And that, given his mindset, that was a very scary thing that he said tonight.
Yeah, I thought so too. Ambassador, thanks. We're going to take a quick break. We will, of course, continue our coverage of the attack on Ukraine that began this evening. You're watching MSNBC. We'll be right back.
Thank you, General. Okay, so U.S. defense officials were expecting this invasion to come tonight under the cover of night. Why this timing? Why in the dark? And was this meant to be a surprise attack?
Well, I think the timing, there's a lot of factors on the timing, and you've touched on a couple of them. Historically and typically, military operations, we like to initiate them under the cover of darkness. The advantage goes to the attacker, and it's when it disrupts people's circadian rhythm. It's disruptive to people's sleep cycles, the Ukrainian military people's sleep cycles, and so forth. So striking during the hours of darkness gives the advantage to the attacker. Why today, I think, is tied to several factors. I think the weather had something to do with it. Weather fairly good today across the country, not as good in the east. But as I've said a number of times, the weather factor swings in both directions. It may not have been ideal for the attacker, but it's not ideal for the defender either. And so I think that was probably a neutral state of play between the attacker and the defender. I think there's some symbolism on starting it today. This is the Russian Army Day of Remembrance. And I think there's in Putin's mind, there was a little symmetry there to be able to initiate this defense of Russian people in eastern Ukraine on the same day. So I think many of those things played into his decision to launch his attack today.
What do you expect the Russian military forces to do in the coming hours? It's just after 6 a.m. in Ukraine. What could morning look like?
Well, look, I think we need to pay attention to what Putin said. What he said was, we're going to do a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine and denazify Ukraine. So I think we should kind of step back away from the tactics of what we can expect to see. I think he's made a declarative statement that he intends to destroy or completely disarm the Ukrainian military, and it will not be limited to one part of the country. When he says demilitarize, that means destroy or disarm their capability to defend themselves. And then on the denazification, I think that's not a veiled threat. That is a clear, unambiguous threat to the leadership, the elected governmental officials of Ukraine, that he intends to replace them. What we should be asking is, if Putin and Russia is successful, how does this end? How does he put his own government, somebody who is sympathetic to Russia, who will be a puppet for Putin and the Russian regime? How will that play out? But I think he has signaled to Ukraine and signaled to the international community what his true intentions are here.
And let's go back to the aid for Ukraine. How much could the military assets provided by the U.S., like those Javelin missiles, help Ukraine in a conflict with a country like Russia?
So the Javelin missiles and other arms and ammunition that are being provided by other NATO countries will be enormously helpful to the Ukrainian military. But as Steve pointed out earlier, the Ukrainian military is good. They're very good, and they're a lot better than they were in 2014. But unfortunately, size does matter, and numbers do matter when it comes to squaring these two countries up against each other. And Russia has a decisive advantage in a couple of areas. They have it in surface-to-surface missiles. They have it in combat aircraft. They have it in combat helicopters. And that is something that Ukraine just does not have, and it puts them at a military disadvantage. So I suspect and I fully expect that the Ukrainian military will put up a very stiff defense. But we're looking at some very tough days. The amount of firepower that Russia has aligned against the Ukrainian military right now is enormous. And I would expect us to see it completely unleashed here in the next 24 hours.
Some tough days ahead. General Abrams, thank you. Let's bring in former Homeland Security official and ABC News contributor Elizabeth Newman now. Today, Ukraine experienced some smaller scale cyber attacks, but Russia is capable of much larger cyber attacks. Talk about what those could look like.
Right, so today we initially saw some DDoS attacks, those are denial of service attacks, which think about not being able to access your bank or a government website where you need some information. It's disruptive, but it's not really of the size and scale that we expect. But then later this afternoon, we actually got word that some malware had been released. It's a data wipe malware, and it had infected, reports are up to hundreds of computers in Ukraine, and the damage that type of attack can cause could be significant depending on which places were targeted. And what some of the cyber experts are postulating, it's all pretty early to deduce everything, but they think that the DDoS attacks may have been launched to be able to distract from the other activities embedding this malware in networks. So it is very possible and likely that we will see more attacks kind of unfurl over the next few days, and with a particular focus on Ukraine. And the purpose of those is to try to cause more disruption, and in particular, damage and disrupt the ability to communicate with the public, as well as to exercise command and control of the military and organizing your response as a government. So I would expect to see more of those. We might also see attacks on infrastructure, taking out the energy grid. They actually did this to Ukraine back in 2015, took out power for about 1 to 6 hours for about 230,000 people. And we know that Russia has pretty significant capabilities, so I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg at this point.
Bringing this full circle, there's serious concern about the prospect of cyber attacks right here in the United States by the Russian government. What is the likelihood that could actually happen?
I think it's pretty significant. You've seen DHS and the Department of Justice actively try to raise the alarm about potential cyber attacks, and they've been doing this for months. They've been putting out bulletins, they've been holding calls with state and local officials, with private businesses, with the banks, anybody that is an owner or operator of critical infrastructure with a particular focus on finance, communications, internet, energy, oil and gas. We are very concerned that those businesses and critical infrastructure are going to